Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone from wherever you're hailing. We're already having some really wonderful announcements of where folks are coming from. It's so glad to be a participant in a global seminar and to have voices from around the world helping us think well about our responsibilities and opportunities when it comes to interpreting historic sites and thinking about various collections and resources that are available. Today, we're going to spend a little time thinking about what's been going on our side of the pond over here in the United States. There have been some really dramatic shifts in historic site interpretations and various strategies, and it is just my great pleasure to have been able to convene today's particular panel. The folks you're going to hear from today have all been operating at the very cutting edge of thinking about how it is that we reshape the ways that we interpret historic sites, specifically sites associated with slavery here in the United States. And so I'm going to spend just a few moments introducing all the panelists at the beginning. I'll let you know the order in which they're going to speak. They're then going to present just sort of 10 or 15 minutes just to give you all a visual introduction as well as a bit of a setting for the sites where they're working and some of the things that they're doing. We will then engage in a brief conversation, dialogue amongst ourselves, and then we're going to open for questions from the floor. And so please be prepared. If you have questions, please write those down, drop them in the chat as we did last time. And a couple of my colleagues are going to help me watch the chat because it was pretty dynamic last time. It was fast and furious. And so we're going to do our best to try to keep an eye on that chat. And I'll be posing questions from the floor. I'll be curating them and sending them over to our panelists. So you will certainly get your opportunity to ask questions. I know there will be many. So I'm so excited for the next hour and a half, looking forward to this time together. Let me begin with introductions. Today we have 3 presentations by 4 panelists. Our first is going to be Ashley Rogers, and she's the executive director of the Whitney Institute and the Whitney Plantation Museum. And once she gets started, you'll understand exactly why she and the Whitney is an incredibly important site for a reframing of the way that we think about site interpretation. We're then going to pivot to James French and Elizabeth Chu, both from Montpelier. James is the founding chair of the Montpelier Descendants Committee, and he's also a board member of the Montpelier Foundation. And Elizabeth Chu is the executive vice president and chief curator for James Madison's Montpelier. And then our final presentation will be by Dr. Mabel Wilson. She is the Nancy and George Rupp Professor of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. And she is also one of the team members for the design for the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers here on my own campus at the University of Virginia. So we'll hear those 3 presentations. We'll then pivot to a conversation amongst ourselves and then open it to the floor. So with that, let me ask Ashley, go ahead and jump in first and tell us a little bit about Whitney.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I know I have a confusing title in several organizations, but I'm from the Whitney Plantation, which is in Wallace, Louisiana. So I'm going to just give you a brief little overview that talks a little bit about our organization. Can everyone see that successfully? I have 2 screens, so this is always very confusing when I have to share. Whitney Plantation is a plantation museum in South Louisiana, and we are located about 1 hour equidistant between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Whitney Plantation, as you can see from the overview video here, you're seeing the depth of the fields going back to the swamp and some of the pieces that are on our actual historic campus. It remains an agricultural place, so it's relatively unchanged from its past. It was established originally in 1752, and it was in operation until 1975. So it has a very, very long history, over 200 years, that span the period of slavery and the period after slavery as well. We have about 16 original buildings, which contribute to a historic district on the National Register of Historic Places, which spanned the years 1790, which was when this big house, the owner's home, was built, until the 1950s. So the history of the plantation is quite evenly split between slavery and wage labor. For 110 years, one family owned it, the Heidel family. They were some of the earliest European migrants to that region. They came from Germany originally. This part of Louisiana is called the German coast because of large numbers of German and Swiss European immigrants who came there. And it was established by that family in 1752 and then passed down through successive generations. So one family owning it for that entire 110 years of slavery. And during that time, we estimate that they enslaved approximately 350 people. That's what we've been able to get from historic records. We suspect that it's probably a number that's quite larger than that because of gaps in the records and because of, you know, a lack of complete records about births and deaths and things like that. Many of the people that the Heidel family enslaved in the early period, the earliest period of slavery on this plantation, had been kidnapped from West Africa, and a lot of the early captives who were forced to labor in early Louisiana came from Senegambia, from the area around Senegal in West Africa. Later on, Louisiana became a major site of the domestic slave trade, and so actually a lot of people came from Virginia. So our colleagues who are talking about the history of Virginia has a real clear cultural tie to Louisiana. Louisiana, New Orleans was the southern heart of the domestic slave trade. Over 1 million people were trafficked from Virginia to New Orleans. And many of those people were sold in the slave markets in the city of New Orleans and then ended up on plantations, just like Whitney Plantation. The people who were forced to work at Whitney Plantation worked in originally rice and indigo cultivation for about 50 years during the 18th century. And then around the turn of the century in the 19th century, the plantation and all of the other ones in South Louisiana transitioned to sugarcane. And so it's been a sugarcane plantation since about 1800. The plantation has the reason why I'm here speaking about what we do is that we have a very different interpretive focus from most plantation museums. And it's hard for folks to understand if they haven't actually been to a plantation museum. And you know, some of our visitors don't know that that's a category of museum that exists, but there are a lot of plantations that are open to the public. And historically, many of them were opened during the 1960s. Some of them, you know, in Natchez and things even go back further in the 1930s, but they kind of opened in a lot of these periods in the 20th century when there was a resurgence in interest in kind of the romantic version of the Old South. And so that's really what you see at a lot of plantation museums is a representation of the wealth of the owners and not much, if anything at all, about the lives of the people that they enslaved. Whitney Plantation is very different. It's funny to be in a historic house seminar because we actually don't really consider ourselves a historic house museum. Some people come to us expecting to get a mansion tour, and in reality, what we do is that our visitors spend over an hour outside on the grounds going through a series of memorials that we built to name and honor people who were enslaved at the plantation, and also visiting the original sites of where they lived on the plantation. So you're seeing here some slave cabins from the plantation, and our slave cabins on site, 2 of them are original and span the period of slavery into freedom. So for the generations that came after slavery, they remained on the plantation living in those cabins. We have, as I mentioned, a series of memorials on the site, and these were all built by our founder. So we also have sort of an unusual founding story. Originally, you know, the plantation was in operation, as I said, until 1975, with resident laborers still living on the site. It closed down after the last owner died. and then was sold to a petrochemical company, which is kind of the story of South Louisiana. So Formosa Chemicals and Fiber Corporation, a company from Taiwan, purchased the property intending to build the world's largest rayon manufacturing plant on this site. And through community activism, that was prevented. And then Formosa sold the most historic section of the property. Originally, it was a 1,700 acre property. They sold 250 acres that contained all of the historic buildings to John Cummings, who was a wealthy white lawyer from New Orleans. And the understanding in that agreement was that he would take it upon himself to restore the structure and open it to the public. There was no provision in there to open it with the direction that he took. So that was really John Cummings, our founder's vision, to make this an experience and a site that honored enslaved people. At the time when he purchased it in 1999, very few sites in Louisiana were really engaging with the history of slavery. So this was very unusual. And then he really had the vision to create it as a memorial space. So he commissioned artwork from, around the country, different people, to create pieces that would, allow visitors to have a space of reflection and contemplation. And what you're seeing here is a statue that's in the Field of Angels, which is a memorial dedicated to children who died in slavery before the Civil War in St. John the Baptist Parish, which is our county where we are. We have parishes. Visitors spend about half of their visit actually in memorials. And you can see here, pre-COVID, some visitors viewing our Wall of Honor, which names all of the people who were enslaved at Whitney Plantation. We also have memorials that were built to honor all of the people who were enslaved in Louisiana, and then the parish. And then also we have another memorial dedicated to people who participated in the 1811 German Coast Uprising, which was the largest slave rebellion in US history, which took place in the parish of St. John the Baptist Parish, where we are. So it's really a very, very different perspective on a plantation. And I think that the thing that we do that's so critically needed at a lot of in our country is that we do provide this space of grieving and reflection. There aren't a lot of places that do that for this topic, for slavery. In fact, the overarching message that I think we get as Americans is that this is something that happened in the past and that we should move on from it and not think about it. And so there aren't enough places where it is appropriate to grieve, to contemplate, to reflect. And that's something that we provide for visitors from all over the world, really. We're going to, I'm at my time actually, so I'm going to stop it there because I kept track of myself and being a good presenter.
Well done.
I will let other folks go on. Yeah.
I'm sure there's so much more to say, and we'll certainly have plenty of opportunity for you to continue that conversation and help us better understand all the incredible things that are going on at Whitney. Let's pivot now and turn the floor over to James French and Elizabeth Chu to let us know a little bit about the work that's going on in Montpelier.
Thank you so much, Louis.
Yeah, Louis, I was going to say, why don't Elizabeth start, and I'll be happy to then chime in when she's finished.
Did everybody see my slides? Am I sharing?
We're good, Elizabeth. Bravo.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about the interpretation of slavery at James Madison's Montpelier, which is a site owned by the American National Trust for Historic Preservation, operated by a private nonprofit, the Montpelier Foundation. It's only been open as a public site since 1987, which is older than Whitney, but considerably younger than some of our other peers like George Washington's Mount Vernon and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. We're located in the state of Virginia, So we're the light purple sort of triangle about halfway down on the East Coast.
Elizabeth, we've had requests. Could you share full screen? If you just do those sort of in the bottom right, there's a display full screen button. Yeah, to the left a little bit. Yeah, there's the 4 little tabs at the bottom, or you could do from current slide, top left.
Okay, so from current slide.
Yep.
That work?
No, that didn't. Sorry, I'm used to using the little icon in the bottom right-hand corner, which is to the left of the grayscale.
I see that, but it's not, I am clicking it, but it's not doing it.
You know, to the left of that.
Oh.
Yeah, keep going to the left, keep going to the left.
Okay.
There's 4 little icons. No, keep going to the left.
Oh, wait.
Yeah,
sorry.
that icon right there. That'll work.
Okay. Is the size normal or have I blown it up?
You should still be able to hit that icon. I don't think you've actually,
Okay.
no, to the left of that. Yep, that guy right there.
That one.
Yep.
Is that working?
It's not for some reason.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and start over. I'm very sorry.
Lewis, I think if she goes to view options at the top, it'll work a little better and go.
Yeah, that's probably right. Sorry.
Sorry.
That's right.
Okay, and do what?
So if you go to view,
We'll first do from the beginning and then do view options. Try that.
From beginning.
yep.
Where's view options?
Up, it should be at the top of your screen.
Is that Lisa Riley?
It is.
It is.
Sorry. I'm just
I'm
trying to
sorry.
help.
I'm just not seeing what I normally see when I do this. And I'm so.
Hi, Elizabeth, it's Mabel. If you see slideshow up at the
Yeah.
top, then you see review. I think Lisa's saying go to view.
No, it's the function, Mabel, in view options from Zoom that lets you do full screen. She should be able to
Should I
do it.
stop it? Should I stop it again? Okay. So share screen.
Sorry, everyone. My apologies.
And this is just not what I normally see when I do this. So I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, I'm just going to suggest that we just plow forward.
Okay. All right.
Is that all right?
Yep. So can you see my slide in a normal
Yes.
size?
Yeah, we're seeing.
Okay. All right. So we're in Virginia. We're about 90 miles south of Washington, D.C. in a area that is still very rural to this day. Montpelier was the plantation of 3 generations of the family of James Madison, who is known to historians as the sort of mastermind behind the U.S. Constitution, the author of the Bill of Rights, Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, and 4th president from 1809 to 1817. His wife, Dolly, is known as sort of the person who created the role of First Lady of the U.S. as we still think of it. Madison was a lifelong slaveholder, who never sold a single slave, and who did in 1832 sell slaves to Louisiana. Montpelier is somewhat unique in that the property is so large and had different owners over time, and that we're able to interpret at Montpelier not just American slavery, but we also have a building that enables us to interpret the era of emancipation and Reconstruction. And then we have a train depot that enables us to interpret the segregation Jim Crow era. What is unique to a degree about Montpelier is the degree to which staff at Montpelier has collaborated for over 20 years with the community of descendants of people who were enslaved here. And that collaboration started in really the late 1990s, and it's continued to the present day. I'm going to talk just very briefly about the idea of community engagement. I'm not going to go into the details of the African Burial Ground Project in Lower Manhattan because it's a very complicated story, but there's things online to read about it. But to make a very complicated story short, in the construction of a federal office building in Lower Manhattan in the early 1990s, a very large burial ground of Africans, over 400 individual burials were found. And after lots of doing the wrong thing and lots of haggling and debate, an anthropologist named Michael Blakey, who was then at Howard University, came in to work with the local African-American community to create an ethical community engagement. And he's a person that coined the term descendant community. And because the world is a very surprising place, Michael Blakey's ancestors were enslaved at Montpelier. And he's been an active member of the Montpelier descendant community himself. So the very first descendant to come to Montpelier actually came in 1992. And her name is Betty Kearse, and she has a very strong family oral history of being enslaved, of being a child of President, her ancestor being a child of President James Madison. And we have worked with her to follow her story ever since. And she published a book last April entitled The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family. The descendant engagement really got going in earnest in the later 1990s when archaeologists at Montpelier realized where the cemetery of the enslaved was located. Two local community members and activists, Carolyn French, who's the mother of James, and Rebecca Coleman, approached Montpelier about doing an event to commemorate the cemetery. After that experience, Carolyn French and Rebecca Gilmore Coleman created the Orange County African American Historical Society, which served as the first organization to partner with Montpelier. And the very first project that we embarked on was the restoration of a house across the street where Rebecca's freed ancestors had lived after being emancipated from Montpelier. And Rebecca's family was deeply involved in the archaeology and the research to understand and make decisions about the restoration. And here's how that property looks today, where we interpret emancipation and the Reconstruction era. Back on the at the side of the Madison's house. So another long, complicated story that I'm going to really shorten is that the Montpelier house had been added onto over time and was restored between 2003 and 2008. And at the time of the conclusion of the restoration, a group of descendants visited and looked over the area where we knew there had been slave dwellings and workspaces for the enslaved domestic workers. And a community member named Iris Ford said to the staff, well, you just spent $24 million restoring this house. Where are my people? When I look out there, all I see is dead grass and railroad ties, because there were some railroad ties kind of outlining the area. So Montpelier staff, in response to that, created these timber frame outlines to suggest the location of the slave dwellings and work buildings very close to the house. And I'm kind of going chronologically. Along the way, we also worked on the restoration of a Jim Crow era segregated train station that's on our property. And the same descendant, Iris Ford, and her first cousin, Madeline Anglin, served as advisors on that project because they remembered living in Jim Crow, Orange, Virginia in the 1950s and 60s. So back to the big house and the slave dwellings, we were able to do archaeology on the site to understand the 6 buildings that had been there. Descendant community members were involved in the archaeology process, and many people found it very profound to unearth an object in the excavation, the the last person to touch it had been an ancestor. We gathered a group to talk about interpretation in 2014, and they advised actually reconstructing all the buildings. A $10 million gift from the American philanthropist David Rubenstein enabled that to happen, and we began to reconstruct the buildings. And if you stand today and look out at the South Yard, what you see is basically the sixth one is currently being finished, but we've reconstructed the 6 slave dwellings and work buildings that make slavery impossible to deny on the landscape. This was done very carefully. We protected the archaeological remains to build the buildings over them. Now that was part of this other big project, which was to create an exhibition about slavery that's entitled The Mere Distinction of Color. Again, we worked with members of the descendant community, and the very big request was to emphasize the humanity of their ancestors and not to leave slavery in the past. So we opened an exhibition in 2017 that attempted to do just that. We were very intentional about including every name that we knew, of including images from a collection in the Library of Congress of photographs of people who had lived in slavery, not at Montpelier, but we thought that it was so important to evoke human presence that we used these photos, and we used shadows projected onto the walls of the exhibition to suggest human activity, universal human activity, human presence, to create empathy in visitors. But the members of the descendant community also served as critically important advisors and resources, and their own faces and voices actually are in the exhibition, telling the stories of their enslaved ancestors and the stories of their own experience of learning about enslavement in their family history. We have 2 very impactful media pieces, one that tells the story of Dolly Madison selling enslaved people after James Madison's death, even though he asked her not to, and a very impactful film about the legacies of slavery that I'll be very happy to share with anybody who would like to see it. Outside in the rebuilt slave buildings, we did interpret some of the living spaces, but we also, again, have the faces and voices of descendants appearing. I'm gonna conclude, and I'm very sorry about the jumbled nature of this, but one of the very important outcomes of our work with the descendant community was a gathering that we had here at Montpelier in February of 2018 of descendant community members from all over the US, including Ashley Rogers from Whitney and a member of the descendant community there, Joy Banner. Descendant community members, museum professionals, and academics. And we created a rubric of best practices for descendant engagement in the interpretation of slavery at museums and historic sites that has now been published in the field and elsewhere, and adapted by other sites around the world. This is a gathering in June of 2019 where descendants came back together, and I'm going to stop here so that my colleague James French can speak.
Perfect place to transition here. So thank you, Elizabeth. My name is James French. I wear a bunch of different hats, but my involvement in this really is standing on the shoulders of so many others. You saw that Elizabeth referred to my mother, Carolyn French, who is a descendant of the enslaved of the Newman and the Barber plantations, which adjoin the Madison plantations. And this was this area of Virginia I like to think of as an arc of enslaved communities, and along the Southwest Mountains, which is the Piedmont region of Virginia. And it just so happened to be a very important historical district because so many iconic events in American history happened there, including the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and a lot of the intellectual heavy lifting of the American Revolution came from that region. But very little was known about the people who actually enabled it to exist, enabled this region to exist, and they were obviously the enslaved. So I was living overseas. I've lived most of my life, my adult life, in Africa, and I was living in South Africa, and just came back from South Africa, and I was invited by Montpelier to attend this meeting that Elizabeth has referred to in 2019, a gathering of descendants. And the idea was we were invited to gather and organize a group to represent ourselves at Montpelier. And I had no other inkling or background or knowledge of where we would go. I attended the meeting, and I was asked by the delegates to chair the newly created organization. And what we did was we named it the Montpelier Descendants Committee. And the thinking that I had there was we wanted to create something that would empower the descendants. A lot of the early the work that you just heard from Elizabeth about the archaeology and the cabins and some of the grave sites led to the question of, okay, what next? We know we have physical evidence now of the existence and the importance of the slavery presence. But how do we center their stories in the larger narrative of Montpelier? Montpelier is known essentially as the place where the Bill of Rights and the Constitution was written. But how do we, that's from, if you will, a perspective that erases the enslaved. So how do we center that? And one of the things that we need to do to center it is that we have to have some influence in decisions being made by the plantation site. And so it quickly became apparent that we needed some degree of power. So I kind of began to think about how that could be achieved. And the name Montpelier Descendants Committee was borrowed in my thinking from something that James Madison himself did during the American Revolution. He formed something called the Virginia Committee of Safety. And that committee was formed to, quote, alarm, muster, and cause to be assembled as much provincial militia as needed to further the aims of the revolution. So we were faced with the same question. There's been some initial work done, but we have no power. We have no say. How do we do that? We have to create some degree of authority and decision-making power in the interpretation of history that's been erased in a context that has traditionally not asked our opinion. So we were inspired by two groundbreaking academic paradigms. One is called the Rubric, and that was just mentioned by Elizabeth Chu. It was written by an assembly and gathering of scholars in history and archaeology at Montpelier. So it was a Montpelier document sponsored by the National Trust, which owns Montpelier. And then also the work by called the clientage model by Dr. Michael Blakey, who you also just were introduced to, who created the African Burial Ground in New York City. And so the rubric essentially, I'll just paraphrase it because it's quite a rich document, and I encourage you to look at it. But the rubric essentially says that the descendants of the enslaved should have parity. They should have, and by parity they mean equal say, equal authority, equal power in the interpretation of these sites where their ancestors were enslaved. And it's essentially an evaluation framework. It just basically asks a bunch of questions intended for the administrators, the stewards of the sites, to answer about where they are if they were to, go towards parity of the enslaved, the descendants of the enslaved. Where we were was nowhere near that level of parity. We were not really even recognized by the the managers, the foundation, Montpelier Foundation of the site. We formed, but only one, we invited the entire board to come to our initial meeting. Only one board member came. And so we were kind of out in the cold. We weren't recognized, we formed, we knew who we were, they didn't know who we were. So if we were to use that framework, we would score pretty low down in the various different levels. And then there was another paradigm or academic work that I mentioned called the clientage model. Clientage model essentially is what Dr. Blakey did. And Dr. Blakey created a model in which you have three different partners in the interpretation of sites. And one is what he calls the business model. The other, and that is essentially the funder of the site, the funder of the excavation, the funder of the research being done. And then the second one is, the second party is the professional, the professional client. And that would be, archaeologists, historians, the academic specialists, the experts who kind of do the research, do the work. And those two often conflict. As I'm sure most of you know, if you've been involved in any type of this work, those who provide the funding and those who do the expertise often want to do very different things. But you have to have some way of resolving these conflicts. And the third party is the party that the model proposes that resolves conflicts and provides direction. And that's what he calls the ethical client. And the ethical client are the people who have skin in the game, those who can be damaged by misinterpretation, those who can be damaged by bad decisions, those who can be damaged by erasure, further erasure. And those are in Dr. Blakey's experience at the African burial ground were the descendants of those who were buried at this site in Manhattan. We combine these two models and we use them as a, if you will, a guide to demanding representation and power and authority. And that process began in 2019. What we have done now is since 2019, we had a change in the chairman and the board at Montpelier. We've had a change in the CEO. I would have to say that that change has been marked by a more conservative outlook on what co-stewardship would look like. And so we kind of had to start at scratch. And then last year, at the beginning of last year, as you know, two huge events occurred. We had COVID-19, the pandemic, and we had the murder of George Floyd. And those two events changed everything. It changed the urgency of our demands, and it changed the urgency of the stability and the future sustainability of all of plantation museums, because suddenly plantation museums could not receive physical visitors. So all that is to say that it became, the stakes were raised and it became really vital for parties to sit down and negotiate. So what we're still doing now is we are negotiating structural parity. Our model is called structural parity, and that's equal representation, authority, and decision-making power for the Descendants community on the board of Montpelier. And we're not there yet. It has not been easy. It requires explaining to a largely traditional white board why they should bother, why they should listen to the voices of the enslaved, why the work that has been done up to now, such as the exhibit on a mere distinction of color, is not enough. Hasn't that box been ticked? Isn't, what else do you want? There's been some of that, and there's been also various different degrees of frankly just ahistorical knowledge on the board about the history of the founding and the importance of slavery to that. And so we've had to do, on the one hand, an educational mission, and on the other hand, a very tense negotiation process. We have been joined by mediators who were hired by the National Trust to help guide some of these conversations. And essentially what it is flipping orthodoxies, if you will, and renegotiating legacy power structures so that we can bring Montpelier to a different era of engagement, of public engagement. Our desire as the MDC is to center our narratives and to build a commitment to produce a more courageous, complete and truthful programming and research. And we're convinced that and experience has shown that new approach will broaden audiences and will include wider and younger demographics and draw them into our history, and so that they can see people like them included in the history of the founding of the nation. And then we also see evidence already that it generates new philanthropic support from new quarters where it didn't exist in the past. So we're very optimistic about what the future looks like, but negotiating through the legacy stewards, if you will, so negotiating with them has been a very arduous process. And we believe that this experience holds lessons for other museum and stewards of public and private spaces of how to renegotiate power equations. And we believe that this, we've already seen applications to, say, the National Park Service and other organizations that have some of the same issues, looking at stakeholders who have been traditionally excluded from the power discussions and the decisions that have been made about who owns the property, who has a right to say how the property is used. We've been asked to speak to those to parties in different sectors, and we believe that what we're doing is creating a national model for this type of resolution of kind of power dynamics. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions at a later point.
Thank you very much, James. I think you all can appreciate why both Whitney and Montpelier are at the front edge of these conversations and really responding to our critical moment in so many really, really important ways, both in interventions in the physical environment, flipping the script when it comes to telling a very different history, but also, as James was just pointing out, reimagining power structures and governance models so that different people's voices are actually at the table when it comes to making decisions and governing authority. We'll have an opportunity to turn to Q&A in just a few minutes. First, I want to turn the floor over to Mabel Wilson, who will be our last speaker.
Forgot to unmute myself. Great. Very much an honor to be here and to share this work with you. I am an architect by training. I am also a cultural historian. So I'm coming from a slightly different perspective than the three previous, I think, presentations. But hopefully it will contribute productively, I think, to the conversation today. I just want to start to say I'm speaking on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape, and I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future presence of the Lenape on their homeland. So Thomas Jefferson, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the second governor of Virginia, third president of the United States, plantation owner, Monticello, and owner of 600 enslaved men, women, and children, over the course of his life, realized his long-term desire to create an academical village. When it opened in 1826, the University of Virginia's Tin Pavilion housed faculty and family. Its lawn rooms bordered 125 white male students, and the verdant swath of the terrace lawn was crowned, as you see here, by the rotunda, the library, the centerpiece of this ensemble. What was silent in the official historical narratives of the university's antebellum period from 1817 to 1865 was mention of the academical village's dependency on an equal number, roughly 150 at one time, enslaved people. And we see here an enslaved woman taking care of a white child of one of the professors. So this lay hidden for over 150 years, and this hidden history became more tangible to the community when archaeologists discovered 70 unmarked graves behind UVA's official cemetery. And here you see a ceremony of memorialization in the cemetery that began in the Charlottesville community, whose descendants at that time remained mostly unknown. So in 2016, I joined with architect Mijin Yoon and Eric Haller, and you can see Mijin on the left here, and conflict mediator Frank Dukes, along with landscape architect Greg Bleem, to win the commission to design the memorial to enslaved laborers, which opened this past spring. Brooklyn artist Edo Otetigbe joined us a year later. And so on the right, you actually see Frank and Eto at Montpelier. I believe in the yellow shirt, though I can't see her face, is Naya Bates, who's the public historian at Monticello. So it was very important to have both dialogues with both those entities as well as their descendant communities. And so here you can see our timeline of intensive engagement process. And Frank Dukes was very integral to that. And Frank is actually out there today. Hi, Frank. And so over the course of about 6 months, we engaged multiple stakeholders on their turf. That meant going to classrooms at the university with students and alumni, meeting with local committee members at Jefferson School, the Jefferson School, which is an African-American Heritage Center. We went to local historic African-American churches and to the presidential homes of Jefferson and Madison to talk to members of the descendant communities who were enslaved there. And you can see we did many forms on the lower right. You see there was an online survey. And so before we put so-called pen to paper, it was important to really listen to what people imagined and what really were the stakes of a project like this memorial. So in that 6 months in engagement, what we heard was that the memorial needed to tell the unvarnished truth about the past to have any legitimacy. It needed to bring the community together to both learn and reflect on that history. And it needed to express dualities, which was not only pain and suffering, but also the resilience, dignity, and the humanity of those who were enslaved. And we recognize in these conversations that this really needed to be a living memorial, an ongoing memorial to acknowledge that the work of this commemorative landscape remains incomplete. We live in the afterlife of slavery. So to show the sort of placement of the memorial, it's in dialogue with the rotunda. The rotunda sits at the highest point on the lawn. And that actual careful terracing of the lawn section allowed Thomas Jefferson to create pavilions that were 2 stories on the long side, 3 stories on the garden side, creating a lower level basement area that housed the spaces of labor of the enslaved. The spaces behind the pavilions, the famous, enclosed by the famous serpentine walls, were actually workyards where the enslaved labored. So Jefferson understood slavery to be abhorrent and employed architecture and the architectural section to conceal it. By contrast, the memorial architecture reveals, it opens and invites, and it creates an open-like bowl figure as opposed to the closed sphere of the rotunda. Both are 80 feet in diameter. We heard from outreach that the memorial had to forge a connection with the community. So we cited the memorial sort of on the edge of the historic site of the grounds as a threshold, and it belongs and joins to a local commemorative landscape with its circular lawn designed to be a gathering space for the yearly Freedom and Liberation Day on March 3rd that remembers the day that Union troops liberated 14,000 enslaved people in Albemarle County, where Charlottesville is located. To develop the layered histories of the memorial, we worked closely with a group of committed historians, that would be Lewis, but a really remarkable group of people, To name names, which is what we heard, to tell the story of the enslaved community required we engaged in an archive of work ledgers and personal letters of slave owners. And as such, it is an archive of daily life, one laced with silences and with violence. Lewis Nelson and Maureen McGinnis's recent publication, Educated in Tyranny, provided a much needed context to understand the lives of the enslaved. Historians estimate about 4,000 men, women, and children built, labored, and lived at UVA from 1817 to 1865, but we know very little about the details of their lives. And so all 4,000 are recognized in the memorial by memory marks, which are arrayed across the inner arc of the memorial. And so as you walk in, you become enveloped by a genealogical cloud of names and relationships. The list of names, which are traditional features of Western memorials, reimagines social relationships and rehumanizes the experience of the enslaved. So as a result, visitors engage Henry, Isabella Gibbons, Jane, Jack, Robert, and Randall as families of sisters, grandmothers, uncles, and friends, and as workers who took pride in their work as woodcutters, janitors, laundresses, and fiddlers. Carved into the granite, you see these 4,000 memory marks that speak back, sometimes with tears, to their descendants and to us. The names remembering the enslaved are across from a bench with a timeline and a water feature that captures the attention of visitors who learn a very different history of the university. So in contrast to the wall of marks and names, which rises and inclines outward, a shallow, near level water table shares with visitors the history of enslavement at the university. The 70 entries, again, we worked with a great group of historians on this, inscribed into the water table, begin with the arrival of the enslaved to Virginia in 1619. It covers the arrival of 10 enslaved laborers who came with Thomas Jefferson to clear the land that would become UVA in 1817. And the timeline covers a history of transactions, work, and violence. In reference to libation rituals and the currents of rivers that carry people to freedom, a steady stream of shallow water washes over the entire arc of the timeline. Isabella Gibbons, a teacher and founder of the Freedmen's School, which became the Jefferson School in Charlottesville. She's the only member of the enslaved community at UVA from which the archives have yielded a full name, a date of death, a photograph, and a brief written account of her experience. She serves as a witness for her community, and this is what she remembers of slavery. Quote, "Can we forget the crack of the whip, cowhide, whipping post, auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten by these horrible cruelties hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, or ever will," end quote. And this appears in the memorial on the historical timeline. So now we're looking up at a close-up of the photograph of Isabella Gibbons' eyes. It's interesting that the original image is in the archives of the Boston Public Library. Should be noted she was enslaved by mathematics professor William Barton Rogers, who moved to Boston and who would go on to found the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, so that would be MIT. So here we see a section of the memorial surface that engraves the image of Isabella Gibbons' eyes. It was a very complicated process, working with Eto Otatigbe and amazing fabricators at Quora Stone, and also our construction, our contractors, Team Henry from Richmond, who did a meticulous job building the memorial. And so we see this image of Isabella Gibbons' eyes, and the eyes are symbolic of all of those who were enslaved and their descendants who witnessed this change and hopefully more positive change for Black people. As construction began, UVA hired genealogist Shelley Murphy, who you see on the right, to trace the descendants of the enslaved whose names had been discovered by the historians and inscribed upon the wall of the memorial. Pictured here are two descendants, Detisa Gathers and Colleen Yates, who are both local activists and leaders in the descendant community. Colleen, should be noted, is also a descendant of the Monticello community as well. Here you see Colleen on the left visiting the memorial during construction. And so it was important to continue to engage in a dialogue with this emerging descendant community as the memorial took shape. Day after the construction fence was removed, University of Virginia's medical schools, White Coats for Black Lives, organized a protest. They took the knee for 8 minutes and 40 seconds in remembrance of the murder of George Floyd, a gruesome reminder of the violence and injustices that persist in the wake of slavery. The memorial's reflective and inscribed surfaces, its path and gathering spaces, commemorate a community of Black men, women, and children who lived lives, who worked, played, wept, died, escaped, resisted, refused enslavement together. We remember their suffering, their dignity, and their freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mabel. Let me just begin, I'd actually like to take just a pause to honor the lives of so many whose story we have just tried to both relay and honor. It is important for us to remember that this particular history and these sites were sites of violence and that legacy continues. And so taking a moment just to pause in that space in gratitude for our speakers, but also in honor of that particular legacy and those generations of individuals who were subject to violence is appropriate. Thank you very much. So I'd like to begin by asking our speakers two questions. The first question is, what was the catalyst? In addition to the fact that I'm deeply respectful of all of the work that's going on here, and I'm just in awe of the work that you all have done. I think that those of us who might be less familiar with the work that you've just unpacked are sort of wondering, well, how did you get there? Like, you know, these three projects are at the front edge of the work of reinterpreting in the American context. And so if you could talk just a little bit, and I'll ask you to be brief if you can, what was the catalyst that started you or the collection, the group, on the journey that realized the work as we see it now?
I mean, I'll start because it actually connects with some of what James and Elizabeth were talking about. One, I did my undergraduate at UVA, never heard anything about the enslaved history. I remember visiting Monticello, never heard any. We heard there were servants, but that was about it. And so that piqued my curiosity. And I think the thing that really got me going was the African Burial Ground in New York. I was finishing up my master's of architecture at Columbia University when all of that went down, where, you know, I saw there was an effort to build a tower 40 feet high. They discovered these remains. Nobody quite understood what they were. And there was literally an effort to almost dehistoricize the site by digging up I mean, that's how much respect they had for the enslaved, and also that was a valuable piece of property. And, you know, I just started to really think about that, and it got me to sort of write critically, to start thinking. I was actually a finalist for the memorial for that project. And so it just really set me going about this question about why Black people have had to fight to claim space in this country, which led me to thinking about my own architectural practice, and then just trying to understand in a scholarly way, really, you know, the histories of all of that.
I would say at Montpelier that the descendant engagement really got started when the Montpelier archaeologists basically realized where the cemetery of the enslaved was at Montpelier, and that announcement got the local African-American community activated to come to Montpelier to request to have a commemorative service. And of course, James French's mother was part of that. And so I think from that, our colleagues who were archaeologists who were aware of the African Burial Ground Project again, and following that, understood this, I think, kind of new concept of descendant engagement. And they really led the rest of the staff in that. And this, as James was indicating, this has definitely been a case where the staff was leading the leadership to whatever success we did. But it was the community coming to us that really got it started.
Yeah, thanks. James, do you want to add to that?
Well, you said, what is the catalyst? And for me, I think it was a little more personal. I had the advantage of being my mother's son, and she taught us our family history from an early age, and I knew this history. We live in the house where my great-great-grandfather, he built with his own hands, and he was enslaved, and 6 miles away from Montpelier. And so I came to Montpelier knowing a lot of this history, and then something happened. We were told no. We were told, there's nothing that focuses the mind than being told, no, you can't sit at the table. That you need our approval. And that just got me interested in how exclusion is perpetuated through legacy structures of power. And so the more we were told no, the more I couldn't walk away. Mm-hmm. And so that became a very interesting personal dynamic for me. And then meeting all of the brilliant descendant community and understanding the decades really of free work that they had provided, knowledge exchange, the transfer of knowledge to the museum, and really doing it without any knowledge at all by the board, who is telling them no. Board doesn't even know their names. Mm-hmm. That to me was just outrageous. Mm-hmm. At a site where for over 160 years, 300 enslaved people were kept in bondage, mm-hmm. And the Madisons were outnumbered 24-1 by their enslaved. So it was just I don't know. It was just something that you couldn't, in good conscience, walk away from and allow to continue without certainly resisting and questioning.
Yeah, thanks. Ashley, you already pointed a little bit to the sort of catalyst in the single person of your founder, but is there anything you'd want to add there to that particular narrative at Whitney?
I think, in these kinds of conversations, Whitney is never a good thing to measure against because we're so different. And we were founded with the intention to focus entirely on enslaved people. I think our founder, it's hard to say exactly what his motivation was. But he felt that after looking at the history of the site, that the history of the enslaved people there was the only one that really mattered. And he kind of kept that as a singular vision, and we've adhered to that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So the questions are starting to pour in, and I'm going to try to yes, Mabel.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add something as well, sure. Because I maybe too, and James kind of reminded me of this, that if you are Black American, it's very hard to know that history. I mean, I think James has an amazing relationship with his home place, and while I know now through genealogical research that my family is from Eastern North Carolina pre-Revolutionary War, and some from Virginia, the European side certainly have been there since the mid 17th century. I didn't know anything about my family other than I had grandparents. That was it. And I just want to show, this is what I knew of my great-grandmother. And then I found this when my mom passed away. That was the context, right? That she was a domestic, right, taking care of white. So if you don't have home, you don't have artifacts, so that sense of pastness is really difficult to trace, and that has always kind of sparked my interest in digging into those difficult and complicated histories.
So that's actually a really fantastic transition to what I'd like to, as just the next question, even just for a few minutes, and that is, there is both a reality and a narrative around the paucity of sources to tell the story. How would you respond to, as people who have worked with that both perceived and real paucity to actually do something to change the narrative? How would you respond to people who basically come to you and say, or would offer a narrative that says, well, there's just so little to talk about, it's not worth talking about, right? It's the paucity of sources means we can't really, it's not real history because we just don't have enough evidence.
One thing that the rubric is really clear about is that we have to broaden and diversify the sources, because there actually are sources. We have to very much honor oral history. We have to honor humble objects that have been passed down in families. We have to use archaeology to understand the material world of the enslaved. And because there is so little in written documents, we have to be creative and wide-ranging in where we look.
I also, oh, go ahead, James.
No, please.
Ashley and then James.
Go ahead.
This is something, you say the perceived paucity, and I think that that's really critical, because this is something that I talk to other historic sites about and talk to, researchers about, that oftentimes people hide behind this kind of fear of interpretation. And they say, oh, there's nothing out there. But we all know as historic interpreters that we give a lot of grace to people in power in the past, that we actually don't know that much about them. There are ways that we string together narratives about, for instance, slave owners, based on some key, we might know 5 or 10 years apart, and then be able to tell a story about their lives. But when we have the same level of information about enslaved people or people who weren't in power, we say, oh, there's just not enough to be able to talk about them. And I encourage historic sites to investigate how little they might know really about subjects that they think they know quite a bit about, and how they have filled in those gaps, and encourage them to do the same thing for enslaved people. And I will also, co-sign what Elizabeth just said, and the work that we did with the Descendants community. That's really been critical at Whitney Plantation. I didn't really talk about that, but we do have Descendants who work at all levels of the staff, and those stories have been really central to how we talk about the past. So I'll leave it there.
James?
I couldn't agree more with everything that's been said. I would just simply add that there's also a dimension of kind of what, if you look at the trends in the future of the interaction between these sites and the public, what direction is that going in? Is it increasing? Is it plateauing? Is it decreasing? I think the Whitney Plantation has trailblazed, well beyond many of these other sites, because they have proven that there is an appetite in the public for the truth, and the public is willing to come there and pay money and hear this unvarnished truth. In our situation, we had a much more kind of curated version of history that was not appealing as much. If you look at the trend of visitorship and just public engagement, it was tapering off. And so for me, the question itself has a certain level of absurdity, because if people say there's not enough history for it to be significant, the question is, well, what's the alternative? What is this traditional narrative satisfying the public's questions? Is it answering the questions that the public have for these types of sites? And I think the answer is obvious. And so the untold narratives really are the narratives of the actual centrality of slavery to the founding of the country. And that I see as being entirely what our mission is.
Yeah. So I'm actually gonna pick up on something there, James, and package a slightly more complicated question to our panel that's come up in a couple different questions that folks are throwing around. We Americans, we have the advantage in some way of actually having had the history of the violence of slavery inscribed in our own landscape, right? Which makes that history an immediate and a tangible resource for the retelling. What advice would any of the panelists give to our friends on the other side of the pond who feel like, well, I have this country house, we have this historic site, but you all have so much more to work with there in the United States than we do. And so let me ask this in a two-point question. So what advice would you have for folks who manage a site in the imperial homeland rather than here in the colonial context? And what guiding principles might you offer to them as they begin imagining a new course for reinterpreting their own sites? What core principles or values do you would advise that they hold dear as they start to imagine a new trajectory?
I mean, I'll start. I mean, I think there are two things that have to happen. One's a kind of meta thing, a meta transformation, and the other, is maybe more specific. And I think the meta thing that has to happen maybe goes back to James' point about evidence, because I think we have to change how we understand history. And that to me became very apparent working on the memorial. And to open those, I remember we got the list of the history, right? And I had to shut that file because it was so violent. Like, it was just like, how are we going to rehumanize the ledgers? The evidence, the archive is a site of violence. History renders you ahistorical, non-human. History does a certain kind of work. It is not neutral. It, as a discipline and a framework of Western being, is something that produces the kinds of logics of racial difference. And I think we have to recognize that nothing's neutral, as much as we want to believe that. And I think, that's important work. I would just say the second thing is that this is all happening in empire. I mean, Lewis's work really points to that. It's like, whatever's being grown, Tidewater, Virginia, the tobacco, the wheat is going somewhere, right? And that wealth, those materials, are producing effects all across the colonies, all across empire. And so we're all tethered together. I now know, that family that came to Virginia, was from Yorkshire. I mean, we're all connected in these relationships. But I think it's understanding that logic and really opening up new forms of evidence that can be relevant for how you tell the stories of the past.
I would
like to add to that. That's a great start.
I would totally echo Mabel in saying, follow the money. Where did the fortune come from that created the site, the mansion full of expensive exotic goods? Where did the fortune come from? And whose backs was it made on? One of the most impactful feedback that we've gotten from the exhibition at Montpelier is something that I try to keep uppermost in my mind all the time. And this person said to us that the exhibit had helped them remember that slavery happened to one person at a time.
Mm.
Me and James are both unmuting at the same moment. We're just connected.
Go for it, Ashley. I'll call on James in a moment.
I agree with what our panelists have said, and this is something that comes up at Whitney all the time. And I just want to extend this advice to everyone who runs historic sites or who visits historic sites. A lot of people, we get a global audience. 20% of our visitors do not live in the United States. 80% of our visitors live more than 160 miles away. So this is a global and a national audience, and they're coming to Louisiana. And in many cases, you'll forgive me for saying something that's very, strange and silly perhaps, but it's almost like they're coming to see where the racism happened. Do you know what I mean? And then they go back home to where the racism doesn't exist and it never existed. And, no matter where you're from, you are part of this story. And it's amazing to me the number of Europeans who feel that this is an American story and it doesn't have anything to do with Europe. And so there is a global connection, and also even within the United States, people coming from the North or the West, there are stories like this that either are directly about slavery. A lot of people don't understand the reach of slavery in the North, right? Or that are about, different aspects of how white supremacy has been entrenched in our nation's history. And that is a part of the English story as well, right? I mean, these ideas came from somewhere. And so I think that it's really important to think about the ways that we are all part of this network, right? And the ways that these stories are not really local stories. Whitney is kind of a stand-in for what was happening all over the place.
James?
I'll try to answer it in two parts. One kind of theory and then one a little more practical. In theory, I would say you look at a co-stewardship model, find out who are the invisible, silent, perhaps never even engaged co-stewards to whatever site you're contemplating. And that goes back to everything that's been said. The British Empire. There are quite these houses were built through funds that were generated from cane sugar, from tobacco, from rice plantations all over the world, from the Atlantic slave trade. I would say think about it as being the unfinished business of the Enlightenment. And by that, I mean that the Enlightenment occurred, it was created as part of the Atlantic world, and the Atlantic world was built upon slavery. And so, but the Enlightenment doesn't seem, it's kind of allergic to this idea of there being any dark side to it. It's just light. And so the Enlightenment is part of the story of slavery. So think of how those things connect. Then a personal anecdote. My own family history, I said we were enslaved by two kind of large slaveholding families next to the Madisons. The Madisons here, the Newmans here, and the Barbers here. James Barber was a governor of Virginia during the World War of 1812 when the British burnt down the White House. After that, he was ambassador to the court of St. James in 1828. And he had his own English country house story. He lived in Regent's Park in London in this incredible mansion. And he was able to personally furnish it, not the government, but him, through the proceeds of slavery. I visited that mansion the other year in Regent's Park, and it's now called the London Business School. And so when you think about just kind of the amount, the vast fortunes and wealth that this Atlantic world slavery produces, it's shocking, but it's all over. In the University of Virginia, in the archives, they have boxes upon boxes of receipts of things that he bought. James Barber bought furniture that he used to furnish that house, and that the things that he would go and bring back to Barbersville, named after him. So there's quite a bit of evidence, if we need that word, there's quite a bit of evidence of these relationships that is there for the interpretation.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. The next suite of questions that I'd like to try to bundle is, could you talk a little bit about the public reception to the work that you've done? And would you consider this the work of justice? Are these sites, is this new work, is this actually justice?
I think so. And I think of Whitney Plantation as a social justice site and a site that's committed to social justice in our own little corner. We have to recognize the kind of ecosystem of justice. And some of that is about education and truth telling. And so that's where I see that we're able to have an influence. You know, our mission statement is that we educate the public about the history of slavery and its legacies. And legacies is really important to me, that we don't let this story live in the past, and that we continue to think about the ways that we're all still reeling from the history of enslavement. And I really think that, you know, the public certainly comes to us looking for answers. You know, we opened just a few months after Michael Brown was murdered. And every time that there's a major protest around Black Lives Matter, we see more people coming and asking questions and really looking for the roots of some of these systems. And so, you know, I hope that Whitney Plantation, when we're doing our best work, is doing work to educate people so that they can understand the world around them. And I do think that there's justice in truth telling.
I'll jump in as well. I think it's definitely the work is about further embedding notions of justice. In the case of Montpelier, you're never far from the fact that that's where the Constitution was written, or at least the ideas of the Constitution were written. And the Constitution is basically about the right of self-government and checks and balances and notions of freedom. It was written literally on the second floor of a mansion overlooking the backs of hundreds of slaves. And, you know, a lot of the original kind of thinking in that document from Madison's point of view came as a result of his expecting to be discriminated against when he went to Princeton as a young man, and because of his religion, because he was an Anglican and a Southern Anglican, and the Presbyterians there, he felt were going to discriminate against him, and they didn't. And he felt that that was the most wondrous thing in the world, and he said that's liberty. And he came back home, and inspired by that experience, he went down on this intellectual journey that eventually ended up as the U.S. Constitution. That story, the contrast between writing lofty ideals about the freedoms that he wanted for his own children while looking at the backs of slaves, to me, centers the question of justice. And how does the U.S. Constitution, who does it belong to, in actual fact? Where do these ideas come from? If you're in a community, any community that I've been involved in, I'm influenced by everyone in that community. So if I'm surrounded 24-1 by people not like me, and I grow up in that community, I'm going to have a relationship, a cultural, a social, and an intellectual relationship with all of the people who surround me, whether I want to or not. And those bringing those people into the discussion of liberty, I think, is kind of the definition of justice.
Mabel, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. And I think, you know, the question of justice, it's a complicated one, and I'm not sure that the memorial per se is specifically engaged around, it's certainly reparative, I think, and can be understood as a form of reparations. Because I think what might constitute just and fair, particularly in the context of UVA, has to deal with a range of things, from access to fair wages for workers, for, like, there's so much more work that the university needs to do to really make it a just environment, an equitable one, a fair one. But I do think it becomes a site where, and this was one of the things that we really hoped for, that it becomes a site where people can, you know, sort of connect, gather, engage the past, but as a launching point to ensure, you know, that there will be sort of maybe radical transformations in how the university and the city function for people of color in the future.
Thank
You
you all
might
so
be able
much.
to say more, Lois, because
No,
you live and work
well,
in that context.
there's always more to say, isn't there? We only have 1 minute left. Elizabeth, is it to me to offer a few concluding comments, or do you need to say anything as well? Good. Okay. Thank you all so much for these presentations. This has been a fantastic and a stimulating conversation. Really, really grateful for you all to be here. I'd like to offer just a few summarizing points, some observations that I've made, both from the questions that we didn't get to, but also from our conversation. The first, and I think probably the most important, is that there's no such thing as a neutral history. We have to understand that all histories presented in a book, presented on a site, is political, right? All history is in some way political. And to suggest or to presume that the interpretation on any one site is just a normal, a neutral, or an unbiased interpretation is flatly wrong, right? And so we actually all have to do the work of figuring out how is it that the work that we're doing, the history that we're presenting, either in a book or on a site, how is it political? And is that the politics that we actually want to perpetuate? So there's no such thing as neutral history. It's also true, and someone said that all of these sites are, in fact, and all of the sites represented on today's call are implicated in empire, right? So there are ways to follow the streams of empire in telling that history. There's just no question about that. That's on our side of the pond, your side of the pond, Southeast Asia, and everywhere. So we're all implicated somehow in empire and its particular legacies. I really want to amplify something that James said, and that is consider co-stewardship models, right? Consider co-stewardship models, both for interpretation and for governance. That's threatening, it's scary, but it's really, really, really important. And James and his team at Montpelier have been able to demonstrate that it's possible, right? So consider a co-stewardship model. Always remember that sites are always connected in networks, right? So there was a great series of conversations from our Caribbean and from our African visitors who are talking about how there are incredible networks of relationships and connectivities between sites. That's true in England. It's true all the way around the Atlantic world. And so think about your site as it is implicated, embedded in networks, because those networks can open up all kinds of opportunities. And then lastly was just a quick point about K-12 education. We have to remember that we have a responsibility to communicate these narratives, not just to an adult public, but also to a K-12 audience. What does it look like to responsibly communicate these very difficult narratives around violence, exploitation, greed to a K-12 audience? There are resources out there that are available. A number of American institutions have been doing some very, very good work on this. And maybe we'll send up a follow-up email, and I'm happy to send links to a number of those different sources for those of you on the other side of the pond, if you'd like those sources from an American perspective. But thank you all so much for being here. We are over our time, and I'm so grateful for our conversation today.